Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce this virtual event with ETHAN Zuckerman presenting his book, Mistrust: Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them, in conversation with Danielle Allen. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and to our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we host events here on our Zoom account, and just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase copies of Mistrust on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and of our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Cambridge. And we thank you so much for showing up and tuning in for that in support of our authors and of the really incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings recently, technical issues may arise. We hope they don't, but if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. And we thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I'm so pleased to introduce our speakers. ETHAN Zuckerman is the founder of the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and Associate Professor of Public Policy, Information and Communication. From 2011 to 2020, he led the Center for Civic Media at the MIT Media Lab. He is co-founder with Rebecca McKinnon of the international blogging community Global Voices. Danielle Allen is James Bryant Conant University Professor and Director of the Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. She is a political philosopher and public policy expert, and her books include Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality, Cuz, an American Tragedy, and Education and Equality. Tonight, they'll be discussing ETHAN Zuckerman's book, Mistrust: Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them. Drawing on work by political scientists, legal theorists, and activists, ETHAN Zuckerman offers a lens for understanding civic engagement that focuses on efficacy. Mistrust is a guidebook for those looking for new ways to participate in civic life and an explanation of how we've arrived at a moment where old ways of engagement are failing us. I am so honored to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, ETHAN and Danielle.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, and we're so grateful to Harvard Bookstore for the chance to talk about this. Also, frankly, for the chance to visit with one another. Danielle and I are used to getting to see each other in Cambridge, and that hasn't been happening for a while. I have to say one bit of sadness in this is that we don't actually get to be in the physical bookstore. What people don't realize is that speakers in this series actually are trying to pay off their debts to Harvard Bookstore. You don't generally end up as a university professor unless you have a very bad book buying habit. Let me just also say that I've done my best to make this as intimidating as I possibly can by choosing one of the political philosophers I most admire to have a conversation with about this, someone who really inspired quite a bit of the book, Mistrust. And then just to raise the stakes, I am going to have this conversation with my future governor, as of course Danielle is exploring a gubernatorial bid, as well as doing the important work that she's doing over at the Safra Center. So Danielle, I'm so grateful that you could be with us for a little bit.
Great to be here, ETHAN. You always set the stakes up way up here, so we'll have a good time.
It's easy with you, my friend. So look, let me say a couple of things about the book, and then we're going to have a conversation about it. Books take a long time, for me at least, and I started writing Mistrust a long, long time before we had Redditors trying to crash the stock market because they don't trust hedge fund managers, or people raiding and killing people at the US Capitol because they don't trust the news or the US government and believe that Trump should stay in office. In fact, I started working on this book when Trump was still this weird relic of the 1980s who briefly came back to relevance for the birther conspiracy. I actually started writing the book not because of Trump, but because when I was running a lab at MIT called the Center for Civic Media, I began to realize that the word civics had almost a toxic effect on conversations. People would sort of turn off as soon as I said civics. And I started trying to figure out what it was. And was it that learning about how the government actually worked was not interesting? And it turned out that what it really was were the students and the people that I was hanging out at Civic Media simply had very little faith in those existing government institutions as a way of making change in the world. The idea that they could pass legislation or work on someone's campaign wasn't for many of them very compelling. They were much more interested in things like protest movements, like the Occupy movement, which really was one of the things I wanted to try to take seriously and investigate with this book. So this book is really an experiment in taking activist friends of mine seriously, to assume that it's not that they're lazy or ignorant, but maybe they understood something that very serious people didn't understand about contemporary change making. And what I started to realize is that that may have a lot to do with mistrust. A lot of what we understand about social change in the United States comes from the era of the civil rights movement, from the 1950s and 1960s, this really remarkable period of time where the court, the legislature, the executive, not always in unison, but overall managing to work together to take some bold steps to move towards a more just society. And many of my elders in activist movements take not only their inspiration, but often their strategies from the successes of this era. If you hang out in progressive social change circles and foundations, which is the space I spend a lot of time in, you can see people trying to use law as a primary lever for change and thinking about protest and ways of showing public support as a way of influencing that government in Washington. But I'm increasingly suspicious that this is, first of all, not the only way, and maybe in some cases, for many people, not the right way to make change. And I think the key difference, or a key difference, is public trust in institutions. In 1964, really in many ways, the high watermark of the civil rights movement, pollsters would ask Americans if you trust the government in Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time. And in 1964, 77% of people say they trust the government in Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time. That changes profoundly during the 1970s. The Vietnam War, Watergate, the energy crisis. By the time we get to the end of President Carter's term in 1980, only 26% of Americans are expressing strong trust in government. So we go from 3 in 4 to roughly 1 in 4. We've recovered this trust a couple of times. Right before the US invades Iraq after 9/11, public trust in government is around 50% as people are rallying around the flag. Since 2008, we've crossed below what I call the Carter line, which is 1 in 4 people trusting government. We haven't gotten back. It's somewhere around 17%. That's what it was through almost all of Obama and Trump. It's not just the government. It's trust in all sorts of institutions, from banks and big businesses. Hedge funds, by the way, would probably qualify as an untrusted institution at the moment. Universities, the healthcare system, churches, you name it, you can look at it, and we had significantly more trust in it a generation ago. And I think it's really interesting that while Americans have maintained a great deal of interpersonal trust, we actually trust neighbors, strangers, a little bit less than we might have in the 1960s, but it's not the sort of catastrophic drop as institutional trust turns out to be. So why does this matter? It matters because it presents a real challenge for civics. We tend to learn two basic models of civics. One is the I'm just a bill and I'm only a bill and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill that some of us grew up with in the 70s and 80s on TV. But it's the model that tells us that we should work on political campaigns, we should bring wonderful, brilliant people like my colleague into office, and then we should pressure them, lobby them, et cetera, while they're there. And that's how change happens. But Congress has a 9% approval rating. And the vast majority of Americans think that the way in which it legislates is badly, badly broken. And so if your feeling is that Congress really can't do anything because partisanship is sort of grounded to a close, it's really hard to get people all that excited about that aspect of the political process. So the other model we hear a lot about is protest. It's sit-ins, it's marches, it's rallies. And this is the model that I think in many ways we've learned from the civil rights movement. But one of the things that I try to remind people in the book is that the March on Washington in '63, where Martin Luther King Jr. gives the I Have a Dream speech, is a march on Washington. It is designed to put pressure on President Kennedy so that he is able to give support towards the civil rights movement. When you think about massive marches more recently, I tend to think about the march in the wake of the Trump election, where we saw women and their allies take streets in absolutely unprecedented numbers. I don't think anyone there thought it was actually going to pressure Trump to do anything. It was a legitimate expression of frustration and rage, but it wasn't necessarily a theory of change. So what this book tries to do is look at civics from the perspective of people who are frustrated with existing pathways towards change. And here's where I get into a little bit of trouble. I borrow terms from the commentator Chris Hayes. He writes an excellent book in which he argues that left and right might not mean quite as much in the US anymore as institutionalist and insurrectionist. Now, those terms are a little fraught in the wake of January 6th, but let me talk about how he uses them and how I use them. Institutionalists are people who believe that the best way to make change is to step into an existing institution and to try to make it stronger and to try to make it better. Insurrectionists are people who look at those institutions and say, you know, this institution may not be working anymore. It either needs a very thorough revamping or perhaps it needs to be replaced entirely. And my sense is that in civics and in a lot of public dialogue, we tend to take institutionalists very seriously and we tend not to take insurrectionists seriously. And I wanted to try to take insurrectionism seriously. Now, the problem with this, of course, is people are referring to the terrorists who killed people in the US Capitol on January 6th as insurrectionists. That's not the term that I would use for them. I would argue that they're terrorists. They are people who used violence to keep a leader in power despite him losing a legitimate election. These are not people who are interested in taking broken systems and replacing them with new ones. They're people who are interested in perpetuating badly broken racist systems that have been for a long time. And I'm frankly not very interested in those people. What I am much more interested in is people who are positioning themselves either to hold institutions responsible by watching them very closely and to try to strengthen them by putting pressure on them. I'm really interested in people who are willing to go into an institution and try to transform it deeply by bringing it back to its core values, its original intent. I talk a lot about progressive prosecutors, people who are taking the role of the district attorney's office and saying, look, our job is not putting people into prison, our job is justice. And that's a very different way from how that institution functions right now. And finally, I'm really interested in people who look at an institution and say, this is just broken. Maybe we need something entirely different. And there, the perhaps most interesting recent example is the defund the police movement, with people essentially saying, we do need public security. We do need to take care of people in our community. But this institution is so broken and so unfair to people of color and has such a terrible track record that we actually need to do the work of getting rid of it and reimagining what could come in. And then finally, what I try to do is give people a toolkit for how they might do civics this way. And it's not really a civics that gets taught in schools. It's a civics that says, yes, absolutely, you can, and if you can, you should make change by passing laws and having the whole force of the government to enforce it behind you. But if you don't feel like you can make change that way, it's absolutely possible to make change through the market by bringing in products that didn't exist anymore, like electric cars or solar panels. It's possible to make change through technology. This is something that my students at MIT and now at UMass are very interested in. You can make entirely new behaviors possible. Finally, it's possible to make change by directly working on social norms. And I think in many ways that may be the most important, because these days I feel like social norm change often precedes legal change, rather than Loving versus Virginia, which makes interracial marriage possible, which gets through the Supreme Court at a moment where public support for intermarriage is below 10%. In the decision that made equal marriage possible, the Oberfelge decision, we were closer to 65% public support for equal marriage before Supreme Court actually catches up with those social norms. So it's possible that at this point, working on changing the norms actually has a chance to pull law around. But look, the overall point of the book, and Danielle and I think are going to get into a lot of these intricacies of it, because it's really interesting to see we approach these problems sometimes from very different backgrounds, although I think we're finding that we're often finding ourselves in similar places. My point with this book is that it's absolutely fine to be frustrated with governments, with big business, with universities, any institution that has lost your trust. In many cases, they have lost your trust, frankly, because they're not doing their job very well. The key then is to figure out how you can engage in change of institutions. And frankly, it's fine to go into an institution and try to change it there, but also it's incredibly valuable to have the ability to look at an institution and say, we actually need to imagine something really different. This institution is no longer serving its purpose at this moment in time. We need to think about something else. My goal is to help people feel effective, not necessarily feel like they have to do civics a particular purposeful way. So that's the very rough outline. I think Danielle and I are going to talk a little bit about questions, points of contention. Please, my friend, lead the dance.
Well, no, I mean, first of all, it's just such a wonderful book, Ethan. And I think what I'm going to do first to kick off this conversation is to tell everybody about a completely different book that's also called Mistrust by Ethan Zuckerman. And this book is so rich. It has so many ways of being read, but I want to just articulate another way of reading it. So I think what you just articulated was very powerful, because you presented the book from the perspective of lessons for would-be changemakers, basically, in a time of frustration and anxiety. And you're absolutely right that the book serves that purpose, and that is true to your motivation in life's work, and it's a beautiful thing to hear. But the thing that's quite remarkable about the book is it actually also works in another way altogether, another dimension altogether. And on this front, it's really, I think, just one of the best analyses of the state of US politics that I have seen in recent memory. So, you can think Tocqueville, you can think some of the other folks like, I'm sort of thinking of the analysis of factory workers in the early 20th century by Upton Sinclair. This is the kind of social criticism that the book also is. And on that front, it's a real gift to people, I think, because it gives people analytic categories that make sense of the world that we live in. And most importantly, there is this distinction between institutionalists and insurrectionists, which Ethan uses to provide a map of our political landscape, pointing out that in 2016, we thought that the election was going to be a contest between, for example, Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush. And that would have been a competition between a left institutionalist and a right institutionalist, people who were both committed to the core institutions, pretty comfortable, in all honesty, with elite capture of those institutions, ready to tinker at the margins and thinking that the sort of ship was sailing on in a safe and steady way. And that election that everybody expected got disrupted by insurrectionists from both sides. Bernie Sanders on the left side, Donald Trump on the right side. And that's really critical, because what it does then is drive home the fact that we've been misanalyzing our politics for quite some time and failing to see this fundamental distinction. And once you see it, everything makes sense. This is an incredible gift, Ethan, without any question. And so in that regard, then what ends up happening in the book is you have this deep and profound question of why is there such a profound need for insurrection across both sides of the political spectrum? And then Ethan does provide us with this really exquisite analysis of how our political institutions have left us disempowered, without having equal voice, equal representation, and also in so many ways showing themselves non-responsive to us. So I honestly do not think I know of a better diagnosis. And then relatedly, there's the question, well, what to do about that? And this is what, I want to sort of talk more about that a little bit here. And here too, you've given us new analytic tools, because I think this is where the two stories come together. The story about what does a change maker get and what does a sort of social theory analysis of the US give us. What we get from the book is a sort of refurbishing of how we think about the levers of change in our society. A recognition that yes, legislation is one of the levers of change, but so to norms, to the point you just made, markets, code, these things are all places where there's an opportunity to design. And so in that regard, the problem that we face is this huge hunger across our society for fundamental redesign. And the fact that our understanding of what's possible in that sort of hasn't matched up as of yet to our need for redesign. So then the book opens up really to a vista of possibility. Ethan, you really help us think about the different kinds of redesign we might potentially pursue. So I just wanted to narrate all of that because that book is in there too. And that just speaks to the richness of what it offers. So I want to stop for a minute because you and I have been having this conversation for a long time.
We have been.
And when it started, we just fought, right?
Yeah.
We fought because you said, it's all about insurrection. We should all be insurrectionists. And I said, no, institutions matter. Get rid of this insurrection stuff. You're just talking about anarchy. Mm-hmm. And I think, I believe that your position has shifted over time.
Oh yeah,
as
absolutely.
My own.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you could talk about that change a little bit. So, what happened from the point where, for you, the model was insurrection in the sense of let's get rid of institutions. Let's just blow everything up. And now you do think that there's a reason to want to think about redesigning institutions, even as one is also thinking about pulling other levers of change. Can you just narrate your change?
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask you to do the same, because I do think, you maybe set up a little bit as a straw institutionalist early on in the book. And obviously your thinking's a lot more sophisticated than that. Look, I wrote this book looking at things like the Occupy movement coming out of the Obama presidency. I felt like in many ways, Obama, for me as a committed progressive, was sort of the dream president I was going to get. I wasn't going to get anyone further to the left. I wasn't going to get anyone with a more explicit commitment to social justice. This was as good as I was going to get through this system. And yet at the same time, it looked like there was incredible paralysis in Congress. Inequality kept growing. There was not meaningful action being taken on climate change. It seemed like the conventional ways of playing the game had been played as well as possible, and we'd had the best output possible. And still, things were incredibly broken, and it seemed like they wouldn't change at all. And so my feeling was we needed this sort of brave moment of trying to reimagine institutions. And that's really what the book is. You're kind to call it design. For me, in some ways, I would almost say that simply getting people to imagine, what if you didn't have police? What if you had some other way of doing this? What if a nation doesn't need an army and physical borders? What if it's a digital creation? These are things worth entertaining, even if you don't sort of get there. I would say in many ways, Danielle, the turning point for me was not the 2016 election. I think a lot of progressives saw the Donald Trump election and said, okay, at least our institutions can save us, right? Like the government will stand up and be responsible and they'll hold back the excesses. I think in a lot of cases that wasn't true. I think the fact that we survived those 4 years points to the import of those institutions. The moment for me was COVID. And it came down to something very simple. It was early March, and I got on a plane to go give a talk in Seattle, and that's the kind of nonsense I used to do all the time. I would fly 8 hours and speak, and 20 hours later fly back. And I was waiting for someone to tell me that was a bad idea. There was so much information and no way to make sense of it. And the fact that I, as an individual, had to figure out, did I get on that plane or not? I was so grateful a week later when MIT ordered faculty and staff to be grounded, because it meant that some large set of people working together were analyzing data and sort of saying, this is what we have to do now. And it's those moments of crisis where you sort of realize you really do need institutions and you need them to function. And I think a lot of us are finding, in our disastrous response to COVID, um, that many of these institutions are not functioning well and that we desperately need them. And so the term that I've started using, our friend Eli Pariser gave me, is resurrectionist. I'm interested in finding institutions that are not working, and whether it's through the sort of what I call the radical institutionalist of sort of going in and trying to take them back to their core values, or whether it is actually sort of imagining a different one, creating institutions that are more just, are more functional, and that allow us to address that sort of frustration that you were talking about, that sense that these things aren't working. But I think you've shifted too. I think you're maybe a bit more sympathetic to the value of insurrection as having a place within the system.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a couple of different dimensions. I think in terms of what was for me the fundamental shift may have been something that you said in a meeting where we were both fortunate to serve for several years on a commission sponsored by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that was thinking about the future of the practice of democratic citizenship. We put out a report in June called Our Common Purpose. And at one of the early meetings, I think it's you were responding to a conversation about what it means to reactivate participation, to re-engage people in political institutions. And you introduced, I think, an example from Africa, data from Africa of cases where indeed it was possible to generate increased turnout in elections, to increase participation. But then when the result was a corrupt election, all you did was produce a greater level of cynicism than you had in the beginning. And that was the light bulb moment for me, in all honesty, where I realized this sort of myopic picture of focus just on whether or not people were engaged is wrong. That the question is whether or not the thing you're asking them to engage in is worthy of their engagement. And unless you actually do the work on ensuring that that thing that you want them to engage in is worthy, there's no point asking people to engage. And so I became much more interested in the dynamic relationship between the quality of our institutions, the quality of their functioning, their responsiveness, how well they empower people, and what that civic experience is for people on the ground. So that was for me a kind of critical shifting moment. So
yeah, another story that fits with that one, Danielle, which I talk about a little bit in the book, is what has happened with transparency in Ukraine. So Ukraine has had a number of revolutions. They've moved towards much more democratic leadership. And civil society around the world has sort of stepped in and tried to build these sort of organs of transparency. And so there's actually very well-funded investigative journalism. There's lots of extremely clever young Ukrainians sort of trying to bring transparency to the system. And we tend to believe that transparency increases trust in institutions. And Ukraine has been this fascinating counterexample. Those institutions are so badly broken that what the transparency movement has done is actually driven low confidence in government down completely into the ground. And it's raising this question of what do we do when people really do lose faith in institutions? And I don't think we're quite there yet in the United States, but I do think we flirted with that a little bit lately.
Well, yeah, so now let's come to the hard topic of January 6th, okay?
Yeah.
I think that's harder than your use of the vocabulary of terrorists, in fact, would suggest. I think it was a for real insurrection, and regardless of its causes or its purposes, we're gonna put those aside for the moment. I think it was a for real insurrection. And I mean, your book starts with Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion, of course, was violent too. So in other words, violence is not in itself enough for
That's
us
right.
to distinguish whether something is insurrection or not. And again, I'm not saying, I'm not making a judgment as to whether it was a well-grounded insurrection. But is there a discourse about the total failure of our institutions? Yes, there is, right? All the way through the rhetoric associated with that. So to some extent, I guess the question I have for you is, if insurrectionary moments are an important diagnostic, how do we sort out the diagnosis we need from that moment from all of the dreck also connected to that moment?
So I love that. And I'm glad you're sort of sticking me on maybe one of the toughest parts of this, right? Because insurrection is not an unreasonable word to apply to what happens on the 6th. It is a violent insurrection, but you're right. Shays' Rebellion is a violent insurrection. Here's maybe the difference. Shays' Rebellion happens when a whole bunch of farmers from Western Mass, where I live, get back from the Revolutionary War and discover that not only were they not paid for their service, but now they're being taxed to the point where they're losing their farms, and their taxes are not going to pay military pensions. They're going to pay the Hessians, the German troops who have been hired by the wealthy bankers and merchants within Boston. And there is this sense of, this is not what we were fighting for. We were fighting for our own independence, and now we're going to find a way to support ourselves. I think if I were going to draw the distinction, I would talk about the way that mistrust has sort of been weaponized. So I think that there are many aspects of the American system that are not working for many Americans, most Americans, the vast majority of Americans. And I suspect that there are people on the right who have very legitimate feelings that they are not being heard. The problem, I think, is that there's also been certainly a very intense 4 years, but really a couple of decades of weaponization of mistrust in institutions as a mobilizing force on the right. We saw this first sort of coming from Fox News, essentially saying you can't trust the media, you can only trust us, we are the only narrative out there. You saw Trump take it to an extent that I've really never seen in American politics. Almost everybody who moves into the White House says, I'm going to try to make this place better, trust me and work with me. What Trump ends up saying in many cases is, this institution is so corrupt and broken, you can only trust me. The deep state is out to get me, and all the electoral system. So mistrust, which I would argue is on the rise within the American populace for two primary reasons. One is rising inequality, and then the second is actual institutional failure. There's a lot of other factors in there, but those are the two that at the end
of the day, those are the core. I would agree.
To bank on. Then Trump comes in and essentially says, you're right, and it's much, much worse than you believe. You can't believe the media, and you can't believe anyone else in government. And if you lose me, you lose any hope of having any future.
Right.
And I can imagine the ways in which that could be incredibly powerful and radicalizing for the people who stormed the Capitol. What's so hard about it, Danielle, is that what it means is that mistrust is this very complicated thing, right? Because I also see mistrust animating movements that I think have a much more legitimate right to mistrust.
Yes.
When I look at the Black Lives Matter movement, when I look at the Me Too movement, where women are saying, I don't trust businesses because they haven't protected me from being assaulted. I don't trust the police because they're literally killing my community. That's very well-earned mistrust. That's very well-deserved mistrust. That should be fuel to tear down an institution. I think what we're seeing with the CUPE, as I've started calling it for the 6th, it has a lot to do with weaponizing this sort of organic reservoir of mistrust and pushing it in a really dangerous way. But I would admit to you, I'm wrestling with it too. You and I think would both admit to being thinkers who look at things that happen and change what we're thinking over time.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to turn to the Q&A questions. So folks, please do use your Q&A button to go ahead and add questions. So that was super helpful, your distinction between well-earned mistrust and misinformation-based mistrust, in effect.
Synthetic mistrust, weaponized mistrust.
Weaponized mistrust, there you go. So maybe if you just one more word on this issue of misinformation and narrative enclosures. I thought the section of the book, which is about Putin and Russia, is extraordinary, from the way you rendered what it means to be inside the kind of fictional universe of a figure of that kind. And so this does seem like one of our biggest problems, one that our institutions are not up to the task of addressing. So what do we do? Is this a place where we do need something that doesn't exist at all? And how do we think about that piece?
Yeah. The place where the contemporary thinkers in which I found the most traction in writing this book were people who are writing about Russia and the former Warsaw Pact over the last 20 years or so. So I spend a lot of time citing Peter Pomerantsev, but two others who were hugely influential there are Masha Gessen and Anne Applebaum. And all three of those authors are really interested in this idea that there's a model of propaganda coming out of Russia right now, the desire of which is that you don't believe anything. It's not designed to persuade you that Putin is great and his policies are brilliant. It's actually designed to persuade you that everybody has an agenda, and that anytime you hear anyone saying anything, what you should look for is the agenda. And what happens when you do this is you no longer will take anything as a truth claim, right? You simply assume that everything is being misrepresented to you. As Peter says in a reworking of a Hannah Arendt quote, nothing is real and everything is possible. And what happens in that is two things. The first thing is that the smart thing to do at that point is to disengage. I don't care about this anymore. I can't evaluate the truth of anything. I have no idea where I would put a lever for change, and I'm simply not going to believe it. The other thing that people do is they look to see who's surfing on top of it. And you sort of look at this and you go, well, I don't believe anything. I don't know how anything actually works. I don't believe in any of the systems. And yet this guy Putin seems to be doing okay, so I'm going to follow him. And this was the piece of it that helped things sort of fall into place for me. The role of demagogues. Kurt Shaw just posted a question. He lives in Brazil. He's deeply concerned about the Bolsonaro administration. The ways in which demagoguery seems to be able to emerge from this sort of moment of chaos. And Danielle, this is one of the things that I suspect you and I are both sharing a certain amount of terror about, right? Because on some level, you and I are both deeply interested in democratic deliberation. We go out, we get information, we get data, and then we actually have a conversation about it. There is the danger that one of the things that has happened in the US is that we no longer fight over interpretation of the data. We just grab different universes. And if you're in that universe, perhaps that interpretation makes sense. But I'm over here in this universe, and it's very hard for me to even communicate with you. I mean, I'm tempted to ask you how you're planning on dealing with this as a candidate, but that's not really where we go on this.
Exactly. Well, let's go ahead and pull in some of the questions from Q&A, and I will start with Kurt's question, which will take this up a little further. So he's thinking back to Nixon and to Watergate, and makes the point that Scott Armstrong has argued that liberal bias, as people call it, in certain elements of the media should actually be understood as a cynical bias. And so then the question is, what's the difference between mistrust and cynicism? And do analyses of the work of cynicism in politics help us at all at this point?
I should mention in passing that Kurt is my college roommate from
Okay.
1989 when we lived in Williams C42 on the Williams College.
Wow, look at that.
He is an amazing activist, leader, media maker in Brazil, works with street children, does incredible media work there, and is someone who deeply messed me up as a college student because he was so much smarter and so much better read than I was, and sort of forced me to step up my game. Kurt, I think the way that I would address that question is that mistrust can also be the critical lens, right? We need to have a certain amount of mistrust of anything an institution is saying so that we can evaluate those truth claims. And whether that ends up being a liberal bias or whether that's now sort of shifted into a healthy cynicism, I actually think it's possible to have that critical look that mistrust sort of empowers. But I think mistrust can also move to the point where the institution can do no good anymore. The best example I can think of from the book is looking at Minister Ngozi in Nigeria. So an unbelievably bright finance minister who puts forward a policy that actually makes sense. Let's tax gasoline more and let's use that money to support education. This is something that on paper, every Nigerian should believe in. But what she had not calculated was that there was so much cynicism that no one believed that any of that money would ever go towards education. And so suddenly what's happening instead is people's gas prices are rising and they take to the streets. Somewhere that line between being mistrustful enough to have that critical lens and apply that sort of pressure, and I talk in the book a little bit about Pierre Rosanvallon's contre-démocratie. How do you strengthen an institution by pushing on it? At a certain point, that mistrust topples it. And knowing where you are in that cycle between being able to sort of buttress it and topple it, that's one of the other things that makes mistrust such a challenging and difficult place there.
Great, thank you. So another question from the moment, from now, thinking about the election, is the following. Where on the insurrection institution spectrum would you put the voter mobilizing we saw in the 2020 election, especially from Fair Fight and other organizations working with voters who are historically disenfranchised?
So I talk a little bit about the category of the radical institutionalist. And Danielle, that was the hardest chapter of the book that I wrote, and I wrote it for you.
Oh, yay!
No, in a very literal sense, because you are a much less cynical person than I am. You are someone who has been trying to create reform through strong institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to give credit to people who are not just trying to make incremental change through institutions, but are looking at institutions and say, we can strip this down to the ground and we can really make it work. I think that's what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia. I think Stacey Abrams looked at this and said, we're not just going to try to increase turnout a little bit, we're actually going to go fight against disenfranchisement, which has become baked into our political system. And we're really going to take seriously this core value in voting, which is one person, one vote, one human being, one vote, with people having an equal chance to go out and do it. So I think for me, that's an example of radical institutionalism. What makes it radical is not being satisfied with the incremental change that we normally try to have within institutions. It's that willingness to go to that core value and essentially say, inclusion is something that we may now have to fight as hard for as we did coming out of Jim Crow or coming out of other moments like the Civil Rights Movement, but those core values have the capacity to sort of animate it. Now, the flip side of this, of course, is what you're doing at the end of the day is electing a 50-50 Senate, which has a very, very good chance of sort of, being in a permanent clash for the next 4 years. And I guess what I would say in all of that is these are other institutions where we need to sort of take a close look and say, are we happy where it is? Danielle did mention before she was chairing the commission that I happen to sit on, but she was actually running the show. And maybe one of the toughest things we had in many cases was her taming some of my crazier ideas. I tried to get the commission to argue for something I argue for in the book, which is the big house, which is actually returning to one representative in Congress per 30,000 people, which would give us a Congress of 11,000 people. It would have to meet virtually. It would not have a presence in Washington. And by the way, would just obliterate the Electoral College. The Electoral College would basically become the popular vote at that point. I understand that no one's going to sort of adopt this very quickly, but something like the Senate and the ways in which right now it's so badly broken, that is something that actually demands a pretty thorough reimagining, because the incremental change so far has not helped us very much.
But the House could become the Senate, and then we'd have the big house as the new house.
We could work on this. This is, we should have a meeting. We should have
exactly, that's right. But we did make some progress on the Electoral College. We did it come to a shared view across a great diversity of opinion on the need to increase the size of the House to some extent, which would help rebalance the Electoral College. So the imagination that you put on the table was an important part of shaping that conversation without any question. I'm going to pull in a couple of questions now that come from a millennial perspective.
Sure.
There are two different versions, but I think that they are sort of related to each other. One comes in the form of, have you read Pete Buttigieg's book called Trust? He is, after all, a millennial, so hence my cooking up of these questions. And if so, how is your message different from his? And then another question from a self-identifying millennial. I'm a millennial, and I often feel like I've never had good reason to trust the government. Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel? So we've got millennial Pete on trust, and then we've got our questioner who's never had good reason to trust the government.
So many things push back the release of my book. My book was supposed to be released the same week as Mayor Pete's, and my publisher decided that it was probably not a good idea to have a much more famous person than me releasing a book called Trust on the same day that I was releasing one called Mistrust. I have not had the chance to read it thoroughly. I got a copy of the galleys. I started reading it. Look, Mayor Pete is talking about his call to be part of these powerful institutions and the incredibly hard work that it takes to earn people's trust within these institutions. And I think those are both very important messages. One of the things I say several times in the book is I love my institutionalists, I respect them. And at the end of the day, I don't even want to tell people that they have to be insurrectionists. I think in many ways, I'm talking perhaps for the people who aren't going to read Mayor Pete's book because, like our second questioner, they feel so little trust that it's not where they would reach to. To my second questioner, one thing that I would point out is actually kind of funny is that younger generations are usually more trusting than older generations. And in fact, when we look at this question of generational trust in government, millennials actually come out higher than Xers, which I am, higher than boomers. We tend to get more cynical with age. That maybe goes to Kurt's question as well. So weirdly enough, you may actually be at a higher level of trust than other Americans are in government, just statistically speaking. But I think that's the shift, right? Like, I think that's what's going on here. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. And I think like you, I've always looked at government as a post-Watergate and post-Vietnam government, right? That sort of innocence of the government would never lie to us is just nothing I've ever felt in my life. And that critical stance to the point where a lot of people of my generation had to be convinced that there actually was a reason to go into government or to go into institutions, that we actually had to be talked out of the punk rock stance into maybe there's a reason to go into the institutions. I think that's sort of baked in. And that's actually why I was writing this, in the hopes of reaching people like you who might find themselves essentially saying, well, I'm not going to pay attention to civics. My answer is, great. Don't necessarily think of civics as government. Think of it as the changes you want to see in the world and the ways in which you can make them.
Yeah. So one last question, I think, and then we can wrap up, which is, this one comes back to January 6th again.
Yeah.
And it's a question about sort of, that felt like a moment for peering over the abyss.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to editorialize a little bit on the question here. I think what comes through from your book, Ethan, and which is certainly true of me, is that you've been peering into the abyss actually for quite some time. You didn't start peering into the abyss on January 6th. So is that a fair characterization? And if so, then what's the abyss exactly? And how has your ability to sort of look into it, reflect on it, what can you then give us as sort of helpful resources for those who now are kind of newly peering into the abyss?
So I try to synthesize a lot of thinkers and a lot of writers in this book. The one that I think is closest to the abyss is a dear friend of mine. His name is Istvan Krastev. He's a Bulgarian political scientist. And Krastev gave a TED talk, which he wrote into a short book. And the thesis of it basically is that no one is in charge. He's actually talking about financial policy. He's talking about how do you deal with austerity in Europe. And he ends up saying, look, you can have a left government, you can have a right government. The financial markets are going to freak out. There's really nothing you can do. You're dictated by forces that are beyond any individual. They're even beyond the president of a nation. They're giant and inexorable, and so on and so forth. That's what the abyss looks like. The abyss is, there is no governability, right? The abyss is, the United States is so torn apart that we absolutely cannot understand what's going through the heads of the people who are storming the Capitol, and they can't understand what's going through us. And I think when you step back from the abyss, you can sort of say, those are extreme cases. What is actually sort of remarkable is after having their lives threatened, having people die in the building, having the sheer terror of knowing that the Speaker of the House and the Vice President were being hunted by armed people through the building in which they live. I mean, this was the equivalent in many ways of these school shootings that we think about, that Congress got together and affirmed an election. And there was something within that moment of essentially saying, we realize the abyss is here. We realize how close to it we are, and we're going to very consciously take a really firm step back from it and say we're not falling there. What I see in all of this is that there's a lot of other cases where we are not that close to the edge, and where people really do want to find common ground around things, where people really do see that change has to happen. I think of a dear friend of mine, Mike Wynn. He's the police chief in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And he's a Black police chief in a majority white town. And he's doing racial bias training for the new incoming officers in this small city. And he's wrestling with people like me standing out in the park in the center of the city with a sign that says defund the police. And his response is not to yell at me or to get angry at me, but to actually have that conversation about how do we get from this oppositional stance to get to a place of reimagining. And it's that idea that these people who we think could not possibly find a middle ground between defund the police and the thin blue line might actually have a conversation that starts with reimagining. And so that, at this moment of abyss, is something that gives me some hope.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you, Ethan. It's the book is a true gift. So thank you for writing it. And I really recommend it to everybody. I think they put the link in the chat for you to purchase it. So go out and get this book ASAP. You will be very grateful that you did. Ethan, thank you so much. Really
Danielle,
great to spend
thank
time
you.
with
I
you.
really appreciate it. Thank you for the close read and the questions, and frankly, also for the chance to visit with you.
Absolutely.
Friends, anyone who asked a question and didn't get a chance to get it answered, do me a favor, tweet it to me, tweet it at EthanZ, and I will do my best to get back to it there. And please find a way to support Harvard Bookstore. Independent bookstores are some of the organizations that are having the toughest time during the pandemic. That Harvard Bookstore is willing to keep providing this space for conversations about books and about big ideas is just a wonderful, wonderful thing. We're so grateful to Harvard Bookstore, and we promise we will both keep working off our balances there.
Thank you both so much for this remarkable, clarifying conversation. Thank you so much. This is a great way to spend a Friday. Thank you everyone for joining us. And yeah, please stay well. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks everyone. Good night.